Okay, let's unpack this source material on religious fundamentalism for you, our listener.
Yeah, it's a big topic.
It really is. And just hearing that term, fundamentalism, immediately brings certain images to mind, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's loaded, definitely controversial, feels charged.
For many, it conjures specific pictures, tied to current events or
Yeah.
maybe historical ones.
hmm
But for you, digging into this term with us today is really about getting past those surface level assumptions. It's about understanding the core ideas and forces at play, at least according to this text we have in front of us.
Absolutely. And we have a fascinating source to guide us through this often complex and sensitive topic. It's excerpts from Political Ideology's textbook.
Right. So not a news report or someone's opinion piece?
No, it's an academic look offering a detailed framework. It helps us understand the origins of fundamentalism, its core characteristics across different manifestations, and how it shows up in various religions around the world, according to this specific analysis anyway.
That's right. Our mission in this deep dive is precisely that, to extract the most important, maybe even surprising, nuggets of knowledge from this source.
Yeah, the key takeaways.
We want to give you a clear, well-informed picture of what religious fundamentalism is, where this text says it comes from, and how it operates as a significant, often politically potent force in the world today. We'll navigate its history, explore its key ideas, look at its different expressions across various faiths, all guided strictly by the material in these pages.
And it's crucial, I think, especially with a topic like this that touches on deeply held beliefs and, frankly, current global conflicts, to emphasize we're approaching this material with complete impartiality.
Absolutely essential.
Our focus is solely on explaining the concepts and presenting the information exactly as it's laid out in this source material. This deep dive is about understanding the ideas contained within this text.
Not endorsing anything.
Exactly, not endorsing any particular viewpoint or making judgments about any faith.
Agreed. It's about gaining understanding from the source itself. So let's jump right in. How does this book begin to define religious fundamentalism? It starts with the term, tracing its roots.
Yes, it takes us right back to the linguistic origin. The word fundamentalism, it says, comes from the Latin fundamentum,
Fundamentum.
which simply means base or foundation.
Okay, so that immediately points to that idea of getting back to the core, the essentials.
Precisely, that's the root meaning.
And the source tells us the first recorded public use of the term is tied to a very specific time and place, which is, well, quite surprising given how global the term feels today.
It is, isn't it? The text notes its initial use was actually within American Protestantism in the early 20th century.
Okay, Clint, exactly.
Specifically between 1910 and 1915, there was a series of 12 small volumes published by evangelical Protestants, and the collective title of these pamphlets was The Fundamentals, a testimony to the truth.
The fundamentals. Wow.
Yeah.
So the name of those pamphlets literally gave rise to the term itself.
Seems that way, yeah.
What was the driving force behind them? What were they testifying to?
Their core purpose, according to the source, was to uphold what they saw as the foundational truths of Christianity, particularly the literal truth or inerrancy of the Bible.
Inerrancy meaning without error.
Exactly, without error, literally true. This whole movement was basically a reaction against more liberal or modern interpretations of Christianity that were emerging at the time.
Influenced by science, maybe? Historical analysis.
Things like that, yes. Scientific discoveries, historical criticism of scripture, evolving social views. So the idea of going back to basics, specifically to the literal, unquestionable truth of a sacred text, is directly tied to the origin of the term in that specific context.
Okay, that clarifies the historical birth of the word. But as you mentioned up front, the term fundamentalism today is, well, it's freighted with meaning and often quite controversial. The source really emphasizes this point.
It does, strongly. It highlights that the term, as it's now used, is highly controversial.
And in public discourse, it's often linked with negative traits.
Yeah, things like inflexibility, dogmatism, authoritarianism, intolerance, and sometimes even violence. Those are the common associations.
And the source makes it clear why this is controversial, particularly for those who might be labeled with the term.
Precisely. People classified as fundamentalists often actively reject the term fundamentalist.
They don't like it.
No. They view it as simplistic, often pejorative, and feel it doesn't accurately capture the nuances of their faith or identity. They really push back against those negative connotations.
So they might prefer other terms, ones that feel more affirming or accurate from their perspective. The source lists some alternatives they might use.
Yes, the text mentions they might choose to identify differently. They might prefer terms like traditionalists, maybe emphasizing continuity with the past,
Uh-huh.
or conservatives, highlighting a desire to conserve established values. Evangelicals stressing a focus on personal conversion and spreading the faith,
Right.
or even revivalists pointing to a movement aimed at revitalizing religious belief and practice. The language really matters in this discussion.
It certainly does.
Mm.
Now, this is where the source makes a really crucial move in its definition, I think. It moves beyond just literal belief. Here's where it gets really interesting and broadens the concept significantly.
This is a key insight the source offers early on. It argues that unlike simply being about scriptural literalism, just believing the book is literally true, the term fundamentalism, as used in this academic context, conveys a much broader and more significant idea.
Which is?
It describes a religio-political movement or project.
A religio-political movement. Okay, that immediately sounds different from just a way of interpreting a book.
Yeah.
It implies action, goals related to society and power.
Exactly. And according to this text, the defining characteristic of this movement is a profound rejection of the distinction between religion and politics.
So it's not just that they bring their religion into politics.
No, it's deeper than that. The source suggests that for them, politics in effect is religion.
Politics is religion. That's a powerful and, for many, maybe counterintuitive idea in a modern secular context. Seems central to this source's definition.
It absolutely is. And the direct implication, as the source explains, is that religious principles are not viewed as being confined to the personal sphere or private life, what you believe or how you practice in your home place of worship.
Right.
Instead, they are seen as the necessary guiding, organizing principles of all of public existence.
So this framework sees religious principles as applying universally to everything.
Yes, the source explicitly states these principles are intended to govern law, social conduct, the economy, and politics itself. From this perspective, the common liberal separation between the sacred and the secular, the private and the public,
Yeah, that separation most of us take for granted.
is seen not just as incorrect, but often as actively harmful.
Okay. And this source is careful to point out that this phenomenon isn't limited to one particular faith, which I think challenges another common perception.
That's a vital point the text makes. It notes that fundamentalist tendencies, understood as this politico-religious drive, can be identified in all the world's major religions.
All of them.
Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. It lists them all. This tells us that while specific manifestations obviously differ greatly, the underlying impulse described here cuts across major faith traditions globally.
And even within this broad family, as the source calls it, there's variety in the ultimate goals and strategies of these movements.
It makes a crucial distinction here, yeah. Some forms, like it mentions Christian fundamentalism in the USA or certain expressions of Jewish fundamentalism in Israel, are described as coexisting with pluralism or operating within existing constitutional frameworks.
So they work within the system.
Largely. Their goals, while significant, might be focused on influencing specific laws, cultural norms, or political appointments within the established system.
So they act more like a powerful lobby or a distinct political bloc within a diverse society. That kind of thing.
That's the kind of dynamic the source describes, attempting to influence and shape policy or culture, but often within the confines of existing democratic or pluralistic structures.
Okay, but it contrasts these with others.
Right. It contrasts these with other forms that it characterizes as explicitly revolutionary.
Revolutionary.
It notably points to certain forms of Islamic fundamentalism as aiming to construct a theocracy.
A theocracy, right? A system where religious leaders hold power and religious law is state law.
Exactly. And in these revolutionary forms, the source says the explicit goal is to reconstruct the state entirely on the basis of religious principles. In such a system, political position is often directly linked to one's place or authority within a religious hierarchy. This distinction between operating within pluralism versus seeking revolutionary theocracy is presented as vital for understanding the range and potential impact of different fundamentalist movements.
Okay, that lays out the source's definition pretty clearly. So when you hear the term fundamentalism, according to this text, it's less about simply believing a sacred text is literally true, though. That can certainly be part of it.
It often is, yeah.
And much more fundamentally, about a dynamic movement or political project that believes religion should organize and govern all aspects of public life.
Right.
from law to economy to social conduct. That definition immediately takes us beyond narrow stereotypes, doesn't it?
It really reframes it. It positions it as a distinct kind of political force active in the modern world.
Speaking of the modern world, the source then delves into the origins and development of fundamentalism, and it presents what seems like a contradiction right at the start.
It does, yeah. A really fascinating paradox. The source states that despite its clear, backward-looking emphasis and evident anti-modernism, in terms of values and goals,
Right, wanting to go back.
religious fundamentalism is very much a creature of the modern world.
How can something that seems to reject the modern world be a product of it? That's the puzzle.
That's exactly the puzzle the source presents. It argues that most commentators see fundamentalism as a distinctively modern phenomenon,
Not ancient.
not ancient in its current form. While it briefly mentions influential historical precedents like figures like Thomas Müntzer from the Anabaptist movement, or Jean Calvin setting up his system in Geneva, or maybe the English Puritans in New England trying to build societies on religious foundations.
Mhm.
The text emphasizes that the scale, the nature, the political potency of the fundamentalism we're discussing today are largely products of the modern era.
And this modern emergence directly challenged a widely accepted academic theory about social progress, didn't it?
It completely upended the secularization thesis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Explain that thesis for us again briefly.
The secularization thesis was this powerful argument that modernization, industrialization, education, science would inevitably lead to the decline of religion's influence in public life.
Okay.
The theory basically predicted the victory of reason and science over faith, with secular values and institutions displacing spiritual ones as societies developed.
So the expectation was that as countries modernized, religion would kind of retreat into the private sphere and become less politically relevant.
Exactly. Tidy, predictable. But the source highlights that the dramatic upsurge in overtly political religious fundamentalism in the final decades of the 20th century did the exact opposite.
Right.
It completely confounded that thesis. Far from declining, religious movements gained renewed potency and, crucially, assumed an overtly political form on a global scale.
And this resurgence wasn't confined to one region or faith, as the source points out. It wasn't just an Islamic thing.
No, that's vital. While it became strongly evident in Islam in the 1970s, the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran being a pivotal moment, obviously.
Huge moment.
The 1980s made it clear this was a cross-religious phenomenon. Fundamentalist movements gained political traction within Christianity, particularly the New Christian Right in the USA, and also within Hinduism and Sikhism in India during that decade.
So if modernization was supposed to lead to secularization and religion's retreat, why did this surge in politically active religious movements happen? What are the underlying causes, according to this analysis?
Well, the source is cautious about providing a single, universal cause. It says generalizing is difficult because, the movements differ based on their specific religious and ideological foundations.
Makes sense.
However, it asserts that what is clear is that fundamentalism tends to arise in deeply troubled societies.
Trouble in what way? Economically, politically?
Specifically, societies experiencing an actual or perceived crisis of identity.
A crisis of identity. Oh, that suggests a disruption or questioning of established norms, values, collective self-understanding.
Exactly. In a rapidly changing world, who are we? What holds us together?
Right.
And the source references Ruthven, who suggested back in 2004 that at its root, fundamentalism is driven by a search for meaning in a world characterized by growing doubt, uncertainty, and a perceived loss of traditional anchors.
Okay, so a search for meaning and identity in troubled times. That makes intuitive sense. What are the key contributing factors this source identifies for fostering this environment and leading to the fundamentalist surge?
The first one it discusses is a theory that got a lot of attention, though it's quite controversial. Samuel Huntington's idea of a clash of civilizations.
Yes, the idea that future conflicts would be based on cultural lines, not ideology.
Right. Huntington's thesis linked the emergence of large-scale civilizational conflict to the reshaping of the world order after the Cold War ended. As that big ideological battle between capitalism and communism faded, Huntington argued, people would increasingly seek their primary identity and meaning in their distinctive culture and civilization.
And the controversial implication was?
The idea that these growing cultural differences would inevitably lead to antagonism and conflict. It suggested civilizational differences are fundamentally irreconcilable.
And people applied this too.
Supporters of this view have applied it to contemporary events, arguing that global terrorism, for example, is best understood in these civilizational terms as an inherent conflict between, say, the civilization of Islam and the civilization of the West.
But the source is careful not to just accept that uncritically. It immediately offers an alternative perspective, right?
It does. It highlights another interpretation presented by Ali in 2003. This alternative view suggests that recent developments aren't so much evidence of a fundamental clash between entire civilizations
Right.
as they are evidence of conflict between rival fundamentalist trends existing within each civilization.
Ah, okay. So extremists within different traditions clashing, not whole cultures.
Exactly. The source mentions the war on terror being interpreted through this lens, a clash of fundamentalisms. That's a significant distinction in understanding the nature of the conflict. It shifts the focus.
It really does. From broad cultural incompatibility to specific movements within those cultures, what other factors does the source point to?
Well, it looks at the impact of secularization itself, not just the failed thesis. It suggests that while the secularization thesis didn't predict the rise of fundamentalism, the actual process of secularization.
The decline of religious authority in public life.
Right. That process, in many places, contributed to a weakening of what fundamentalists perceive as the moral fabric of society.
So fundamentalism emerges as a response to secularization's effects, rather than secularization preventing it, like a backlash.
Precisely. It's presented as a kind of moral protest against perceived decadence, materialism, and hypocrisy in secular society. The goal then becomes to restore what fundamentalists see as a rightful order, one that reestablishes the necessary link between the human world and the divine will.
And we see this moral protest aspect clearly in some movements.
Yeah, the source notes this moral conservatism is a very visible component of movements like the New Christian Right in the USA and Islamic fundamentalism in countries like Iran, Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan.
Okay, a reaction to the perceived moral effects of secularization. What about post-colonialism? How does that fit in?
The source argues that post-colonialism helps explain why some of the most politically potent manifestations of fundamentalism are often found in the developing world.
Why there specifically?
Well, societies emerging from colonial rule inherited profound problems. Colonial powers often devalued and suppressed indigenous cultures, leaving a weakened sense of identity.
Right, a loss of cultural confidence.
And this was often compounded by local elites who adopted Western values, institutions, lifestyles, creating a kind of disconnect with the wider population.
So just getting political independence didn't fix those deeper issues.
According to the source, no. Political independence didn't necessarily bring social or cultural emancipation. Traditional imperialism was often replaced by forms of neocolonialism, economic, cultural pressures, ensuring continued global inequality and subordination, particularly economic and cultural, to Western powers and interests.
And in this complex, often frustrating post-colonial context, fundamentalism offered something powerful.
It offered the prospect of a distinct, potent, non-Western, and often explicitly anti-Western political identity.
An alternative identity framework.
Exactly. And the source makes a key observation here. Particularly since the decline of revolutionary socialism and other anti-Western secular ideologies in the 1970s, religious fundamentalism has kind of stepped into that vacuum.
To speak for the marginalized.
Yes, to articulate the aspirations, grievances, and search for justice among the urban poor and lower middle classes in many developing countries. It directly connects economic and social issues to its rise.
That link between social inequality, failed secular ideologies, and the appeal of fundamentalism is crucial. And finally, globalization is listed as a factor.
Yes. The source contends that fundamentalism has been fueled by the advance of globalization, specifically through its intense cultural and economic impact on the developing world.
And the timing fits.
It notes that the rise of fundamentalist movements in many countries coincided directly with the period of accelerated globalization in the 1970s and 80s.
Okay, so connecting all these threads on origins back to you, our listener. While fundamentalism might outwardly focus on returning to a golden age or rejecting the modern world, this source makes a compelling case that its rise is profoundly shaped by very modern forces.
Yeah, it's not just looking backward.
Right. It's shaped by the disruption caused by modernization and secularization, the search for identity in a rapidly integrating but unequal world, responses to global power dynamics and perceived injustices inherited from colonialism, and reactions against Western cultural and economic influence spread by globalization. It's not just a simple rejection. It's presented as a complex response to the pressures and changes of the modern world.
That argument about it being a creature of the modern world is definitely one of the source's central contentions about its origins.
Let's move on then to the core themes that characterize fundamentalism, according to this source. It begins by describing it as an untypical political ideology. What makes it unusual in the world of ideologies?
Well, it's untypical, the source suggests, primarily because its main inspiration comes from sacred or spiritual matters rather than purely political or economic theories like, say, socialism or liberalism.
Okay.
And perhaps more uniquely, it cuts across different world religions despite their profound theological, doctrinal, and structural differences.
So, to study fundamentalism as a single phenomenon, this source suggests we need to view the vast differences between religions as somehow secondary. That seems like a big leap.
That's the implication, yeah. The source argues that focusing on fundamentalism as a category means viewing the substantial doctrinal distinctions between faiths, whether they worship one god, many gods, or none, whether they have a single holy book, multiple scriptures, or primarily rely on oral tradition,
All those huge differences.
as less important than the shared characteristics of the political style and impulse it represents.
Ah, okay. So it's less about the specific content of the faith theology and more about a shared style of political thought or approach.
That's a key point the source makes. It suggests fundamentalism is characterized by recognizing certain principles drawn from faith as essential or unchallengeable truths.
Absolute truth.
Correct. The specific content of these truths varies by religion, obviously, but the commitment to them as absolute, non-negotiable foundations is the shared element.
But despite being untypical in its origins, the source still classifies it as a political ideology. Why make that step?
But because it doesn't just stop at identifying truths, it aims for a comprehensive restructuring of society on religious lines and according to religious principles.
A total blueprint.
Exactly. This ambition to provide a totalizing blueprint for social and political change fits the definition of an ideology. The source also notes its potential overlaps with ethnic nationalism, which we'll get to, and its capacity for transnational appeal, particularly evident in certain forms of Islam.
Okay, that distinction makes sense. It's a style focused on absolute truths, but applied ideologically to fundamentally remake society. What are the specific core themes this style embodies? What's the first one?
The first, as we touched on earlier, is fundamentalism's central tenet: religion as politics.
Right, that complete rejection of the distinction between the sacred and the secular. Politics is religion, in the words attributed by the source to Ayatollah Khomeini.
Exactly. The source sets the stage by defining religion in this context, organized community, shared beliefs about transcendent reality expressed in practices. It then contrasts this with how liberal culture and ideas, especially dominant in the West since the Enlightenment, progressively sought to restrict religion's political impact.
Through what mechanism?
Through the development of liberal secularism, and specifically the strict maintenance of the public-private divide.
Explain that divide again.
The source explains it as separating the public realm, the world of collective rules, government, political authority, from a private sphere dedicated to individual freedom, conscience, personal choices.
And the perceived benefit of this divide in a liberal framework, why have it?
It's seen as a guarantee of individual liberty. By limiting the reach of government and collective authority, it constrains state interference in private affairs, including matters of faith.
So religion gets put in the private box.
Pretty much. For religion, this meant it was to be fenced into a private arena, leaving public life, including lawmaking and governance, to be organized on a strictly secular or rational basis. The source identifies the separation of church and state as the clearest manifestation of this, a principle widely accepted as central to liberal democracy.
So fundamentalism's rejection of this fundamental liberal concept, the public-private divide, is absolutely central to its political identity. How does this rejection manifest itself?
Well, on one level, the source views it as a powerful manifestation of the politics of identity, particularly in response to the pressures of modernization. As the secular, rationalistic public realm expanded in many societies, it weakened traditional social norms, communal textures, and inherited values. The source cites Eric Hobsbawm's description of people in this situation feeling like orphans in the modern world, rootless, lacking a clear identity.
And fundamentalism steps in to offer that identity, that sense of belonging.
Yes. The intensity and zeal characteristic of fundamentalism, the source argues, effectively establish religion as the primary overarching collective identity for its adherents. It provides a deep sense of rootedness, belonging, and clear moral orientation that might otherwise feel missing in a rapidly changing, pluralistic, or secularizing world.
But there's a deeper, more fundamentally political reason for rejecting the divide, isn't there? Beyond just identity.
There is. The source argues that refusing to accept religion as merely a private matter gives fundamentalism its radical political character and ideological potency.
Why? What's the danger of keeping it private, from their view?
Because for fundamentalists, treating religion as private is not just incorrect. It actively invites evil, corruption, and decay into the public domain.
Like the list the source gave earlier. Permissiveness, materialism, greed, crime, immorality, all those things.
Exactly. These are seen not just as individual failings, but as symptoms of a secular public domain that's unchecked and unguided by divine principles. The fundamentalist solution, according to the source, is not merely to protest these symptoms, but to remake the world.
Remake the world.
Which involves replacing existing secular structures with a comprehensive system founded entirely on religious principles governing law, politics, society, culture, the economy, everything.
This sounds like a total transformation.
Yeah.
But the source distinguishes between two different fundamentalist responses to this perceived corruption of the secular public realm, right? It's not all the same approach.
Yes, it differentiates between what it calls passive and active fundamentalism.
Okay, what's passive fundamentalism?
Passive fundamentalism responds by withdrawal. It seeks to construct communities of believers that remain intentionally apart from the larger, tainted secular society. Examples given include groups like the Amish in the USA or certain Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities in Israel.
So they believe their faith dictates everything, but their focus is on their own community's internal observance, not necessarily changing the outside world.
That's the distinction the source makes. Their concern is the comprehensive observation of religious principles within their enclave, not the comprehensive regeneration of society as a whole.
Okay. And active fundamentalism.
In contrast, active fundamentalism takes the route of opposition and combat.
And this is the form the source identifies more strongly as a political ideology.
Yes, because it adopts an overtly political stance, seeking to engage with and change the wider society. The source notes that while other groups, like feminists, also challenge the public-private divide in different ways, fundamentalists in this active form view politics quite conventionally in terms of government policy and state action. They specifically look to seize or influence the modern state, seeing it as the essential instrument for the moral regeneration of the entire society.
So, using state power to implement religious principles universally across society.
Exactly. This ambition, critics argue, and the source notes, invest fundamentalism with a potential tendency towards totalitarianism.
Oh.
A state founded entirely on religious principles, they contend, would be almost by definition unbound by the constraints of the liberal public-private divide, potentially leaving no protected sphere for individual autonomy or differing beliefs.
A scary thought.
The source acknowledges this potential, but is careful to state that the degree to which particular fundamentalisms actually succumb to this totalitarian impulse varies significantly. It's not uniform.
Okay, so the first core theme is this radical rejection of the public-private split, seeing religion as the organizing principle for all of society, with varying levels of active political pursuit. What's the second core theme identified?
The source calls it the fundamentalist impulse itself. In its broadest sense, this refers to a core commitment to what are perceived as basic or foundational ideas and values, ones seen as absolute, non-negotiable truths.
These beliefs have an enduring character, linked to an original or pure form.
Yes, the source describes them as having an unchanging nature, connected to the system's original, classical, or pure form. It explicitly positions fundamentalism as the conceptual opposite of relativism.
Relativism being the idea that truth isn't absolute.
Right, the idea that truth and values are not absolute but depend on context or perspective. Fundamentalism rejects that entirely.
And the source even places other political ideologies along this spectrum, not just religious ones.
It does, interestingly, for comparison. It places ideologies that emphasize absolute truths or historical inevitability, like fascism and communism, nearer the fundamentalist end of a spectrum it draws between relativism and fundamentalism.
Liberalism.
Liberalism, with its emphasis on skepticism, open debate, reason, and toleration, is placed nearer the relativist end.
That's an interesting comparison. Seeing fundamentalism as a style of thought, this commitment to absolute basics, that can appear in different contexts, not just religion.
Yes, the source suggests that maybe all ideologies contain elements of this impulse, and within a specific ideology, some traditions might be classified as fundamentalist compared to others seen as revisionist or reformist. It gives the example of comparing classical Marxism to modern social democracy.
Okay, so for religious fundamentalism specifically, where do these fundamentals or absolute truths typically come from?
Usually, though, the source says not exclusively from sacred texts.
The holy books.
Right. And this is often accompanied by the assertion of the literal truth of these texts, what the source calls scriptural literalism. It mentions American Protestant fundamentalism again, noted for its insistence on creationism, the literal truth of the Genesis account, and its rejection of Darwinian evolution.
And this literalism is common in some traditions.
This emphasis on a single inerrant text is particularly present in what are called the religions of the book: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism.
But the source was careful earlier to say fundamentalism isn't just scriptural literalism. Why is that distinction important? Why isn't it just about believing the book literally?
For two main reasons, according to the text. First, sacred texts, even within those religions of the book, are often incredibly complex.
Right, they're not simple instruction manuals.
Exactly. They contain parables, poetry, historical accounts, legal codes, prophecies, contradictions. To function as a comprehensive political ideology, a program for societal change, and a tool for mass mobilization, the fundamentals need to be extracted and, frankly, simplified.
Simplified how?
They must become simple, clean principles that provide an unambiguous religious identity easily grasped by followers. The source quotes John Garvey, calling it a kind of stripped-down religion that travels light and fast.
Travels light and fast.
Yeah.
I like that. So it's a process of selective interpretation and simplification for political ends.
Right. Second, fundamentalists, in this active political sense, support an activist reading of these texts. This is contrasted with some ultra-Orthodox groups who might focus primarily on simply living by the book in their daily lives, more passively.
So the fundamentalist reading is about action.
The fundamentalist activist reading reduces the complexity of Scripture to a clearly defined theopolitical project. The source mentions this is sometimes referred to as dynamic interpretation in Islam, using the text to justify a modern political program.
But wait, if sacred texts are complex and open to interpretation, even activist interpretation, how do fundamentalists validate their particular interpretation as the absolute truth? Who gets to decide?
Good question. The source explains that fundamentalists typically resolve this by emphasizing the authority of the interpreter.
The person doing the interpreting?
Yes. And interestingly, formal clerical position or academic training might be less important than the perceived personal qualities of the individual. The true interpreter, the source suggests, and notes it's invariably seen as a male role, must be a person of deep faith, unquestionable moral purity, and critically, an activist whose spiritual insight is seen as deepened and validated by their experience of political or social struggle.
This sounds like it strongly favors charismatic leadership, someone whose followers believe has special insight.
It does. And critics, the source notes, argue that this reliance on the authority of a single charismatic interpreter gives fundamentalism an implicitly authoritarian character. The truth and the political program become heavily tied to that one person's interpretation, unchallenged.
Okay, what are the perceived strengths of this fundamentalist impulse, according to the source's analysis? Why is it appealing?
Its great strength lies in its capacity to generate intense political activism and mobilize the faithful around a clear banner.
It gets people moving.
Definitely. The source sees its appeal operating on both psychological and social levels. Psychologically, in a world perceived as uncertain, confusing, or threatening, it offers certainty, stability, and simple, straightforward answers to deep human problems. It provides seemingly absolute solutions.
And socially, who does it appeal to?
Socially, while it can appeal to educated classes too, its stripped-down simplicity and moral clarity have been particularly successful in addressing the aspirations and frustrations of the economically and politically marginalized.
Okay.
It offers a secure, clear identity and the promise of restoring social order. Critically, in the developing world, the source notes again, it has largely displaced secular ideologies like socialism as the dominant creed of political renewal and social justice since the 1970s, particularly among urban, poor, and lower middle classes.
So it offers belonging, moral order, and a promise of justice, especially when other systems seem to have failed. What about its limitations? What are the downsides of this impulse?
The source points out that this very simplicity and stripped-down nature, while aiding mobilization, can be a significant weakness.
How so?
It often prevents fundamentalism from effectively grappling with the truly complex, multifaceted problems of modern industrial societies, or developing nuanced, comprehensive policy solutions beyond broad moral principles. You can't solve complex economic policy with just a slogan, you know?
That makes sense. Reducing everything to a few absolute truths might not provide the tools to handle complex policy challenges like healthcare or environmental regulation. Okay, what's the third core theme?
Anti-modernism. The source says this is perhaps the most widely recognized feature.
Rejecting the modern world.
Yeah, it involves a powerful critique of the modern world, often equating modernization with moral decline, decadence, and a turning away from God. The fundamentalist goal is often presented as regeneration achieved by returning to a pristine golden age or original period of purity.
So the common image is that fundamentalists just reject modernity, outright science, technology, modern values, all of it. Is that accurate according to the source?
Not entirely, and this is where the source offers a crucial nuance that really challenges that simple image. It calls that view simplistic and misleading.
Okay.
The text argues that religious fundamentalism is better understood as being selectively traditional but also selectively modern.
Selectively modern. How does that work?
Its relationship to modernity is complex. It's characterized not just by resentment, but also, perhaps surprisingly, by a degree of envy.
Envy of modernity. That really cuts against the stereotype of just wanting to go back to the past.
It does. Now, one prominent face is indeed its strident anti-modernism, most clearly seen in its fierce moral conservatism.
Okay.
Western societies, often seen as the vanguard of modernity, are frequently viewed as amoral or degenerate, having succumbed to unchecked individualism, the pursuit of personal gratification, leading to widespread permissiveness, adultery, homosexuality, things like that.
And this highlights a fundamental moral conflict between liberalism and fundamentalism.
Yes, a deep gulf. Liberal individualism emphasizes individual moral autonomy and choice. Fundamentalism demands conformity to a prescribed, divinely ordained system of behavior and belief.
And we see this in specific campaigns.
Examples the source gives include fundamentalist calls for the reintroduction of traditional legal systems like Sharia in Islam, or Christian fundamentalist campaigns to combat perceived permissiveness through emphasizing family or religious values in public life.
The source also explicitly differentiates fundamentalism from traditional conservatism, even though they might seem similar on the surface with the focus on tradition.
That's another important distinction it makes. While alliances sometimes form between them, fundamentalism differs from traditional conservatism in several key ways.
Like what?
Its temper. Traditionalism is often modest and cautious. Fundamentalism is often strident and passionate. Its aspirations, traditionalism, often seeks to protect existing elites and hierarchies. Fundamentalism is often more populist and egalitarian in its appeal. And its approach, traditionalism values continuity and inherited tradition. Fundamentalism can be radical and revolutionary, aiming for comprehensive societal regeneration. The source even says fundamentalism often favors novel interpretations of scripture to support its contemporary political project, unlike conservatism, which might just uphold inherited tradition without reinterpreting it actively.
So fundamentalism isn't just about preserving the past. It's about using principles from the past, sometimes reinterpreted, to engineer a purified future.
Yes. The source suggests it's perhaps more accurately described as reactive radicalism rather than pure reactionary thought reacting against modernity to create something new old.
It even mentions parallels with fascism.
It notes potential parallels with fascism in terms of its populist appeal, reliance on charismatic leadership, and focus on psychosocial regeneration. But it immediately cautions that this analogy shouldn't overshadow the genuinely religious passions driving fundamentalism. It's not just politics.
Okay, but what about the selectively modern aspect? The evidence that they aren't just rejecting everything modern. Where do we see that?
This is where the source finds the clearest evidence that the simple anti-modern label doesn't fit. It points to fundamentalists' willingness, and often eagerness, to shrewdly exploit specific aspects of modernity.
Like what? Technology.
Exactly. This includes utilizing modern mass communication techniques. Think of the success of U.S. televangelists reaching millions, or groups broadcasting messages via satellite TV and the internet. Unlike some deeply traditional or ultra-Orthodox groups who might shun the unredeemed world, fundamentalists often engage with it using its own tools.
So using modern technology to spread an anti-modern message, that's a fascinating contradiction.
It is. And the source argues that their willingness to use the machinery of the modern state itself, or even accept weapons of mass destruction like nuclear bombs in the case of state-aligned fundamentalisms,
Wow.
suggests more than just tactical engagement. It implies a deeper sympathy for certain aspects of the spirit of modernity, a respect for this worldly rationalism, for efficacy, for power, rather than being purely mystical or otherworldly.
So they value effectiveness, even if it comes from the modern systems they critique.
Seems so. The source mentions the initial interest in developing a distinct Islamic science in Iran, eventually giving way to embracing conventional science and technology, or the search for Islamic economics, ultimately incorporating market principles derived from economic liberalism.
That's a remarkable point. They critique modernity, but they adopt its tools, its organizational structures, and even some of its underlying principles when they are seen as effective or necessary.
Yes. The source wraps up this point by quoting Perrick, who suggested that fundamentalism reconstitutes religion within the limits of modernity, even as it copes with modernity within the limits of religion.
That quote perfectly encapsulates that tension, a really interesting way to put it. What's the final core theme identified by the source?
Militancy.
Militancy, okay.
The source identifies this as a distinctive style of political activity associated with fundamentalism. It is often characterized as vigorous, intensely committed, militant, and sometimes in extreme cases, violent.
And fundamentalists themselves might embrace that term.
Fundamentalists themselves, the source notes, are often comfortable with the label militant, which for them implies a passionate, robust, and uncompromising commitment to their cause. They see it positively.
Where does this militant impulse come from, according to the source? What fuels it?
The source identifies several sources for this intensity. First, the very nature of religious conflict itself.
How so?
Because religion deals with fundamental questions of truth, ultimate meaning, and divinely ordained purpose, conflicts that involve religion tend to be extremely intense. Acting in the name of God or divine will is seen as taking precedence over all other considerations, human laws, conventional morality.
Which explains why religious wars have been so brutal historically.
Exactly. That's one factor. Second, fundamentalism is presented as a powerful form of the politics of identity.
The U.S. versus this dynamic again.
Yes. It strongly defines an us versus a them, a clear in-group of true believers versus an out-group. This identity is often solidified and heightened in opposition to a perceived hostile or threatening other.
And this external threat makes the group more cohesive and combative.
Yes, that external threat, whether real or perceived, tends to heighten collective identity within the group and strengthens its combative, militant character.
And this other can be very diverse. It's not just one enemy.
No. The source provides examples of this perceived other that fundamentalists define themselves against. Secularism, moral permissiveness, rival religious groups, westernization and Western influence, specific nations like the USA, rival ideologies like Marxism, or historical forces like imperialism. Defining the group against this external enemy fuels the sense of needing to fight.
Okay. And the third source of militancy?
Fundamentalists often embrace what the source calls a Manichaean worldview.
Manichaean.
Yeah.
Like the ancient religion. What does that mean here?
It means a perspective that strongly emphasizes the conflict between opposing forces, typically light and darkness, or good and evil. In this framework, if we are seen as acting according to God's will and representing the forces of light and good,
Then they,
the perceived other, are not just people with different ideas, but are seen as actively subverting God's purpose, representing the forces of darkness or evil. They're not just wrong, they're evil.
So political conflict is elevated to an existential cosmic battle between good and evil.
Exactly. For fundamentalists operating within this Manichaean framework, political conflict is viewed not just as a policy disagreement, but as a battle or a war between absolute good and absolute evil. In such a conflict, compromise is often seen as impossible, maybe even treasonous.
And ultimately, one side must win completely.
Right. Either the believers or the infidels, the forces of light or the forces of darkness, must utterly prevail.
And a potential consequence of this militancy in view of divine law is a willingness to engage in actions outside of or even against human law or constitutions, because God's law is higher.
Yes, that's a key implication. God's law is seen as superior to any human-made law. Although, the source is careful to note again that fundamentalists don't necessarily disregard human law entirely. It points back to the example of the New Christian Right in the USA, which strongly supports law and order,
Right.
but within a framework where they believe human law should ultimately align with divine principles. So they might obey the law while trying to change it to fit their view of God's law.
But the most controversial aspect linked to this militancy is its connection to violence and terrorism. That's the image many people have.
It is, and the source addresses this directly and carefully. It acknowledges that the popular image of fundamentalism is often dominated by extreme examples like suicide bombers and terrorists.
Yeah?
But it stresses that this image is unbalanced and misleading. It states clearly that fundamentalist protest and activity are overwhelmingly peaceful and usually legal. That's important context.
Peaceful and legal, usually.
Yeah. But it immediately follows this crucial qualification by stating that, nonetheless, it is impossible to deny a link with terrorism and violence.
So the link exists, even if it's not the norm.
Yes. And it provides specific, dramatic examples from history to illustrate this link in extreme cases where fundamentalist ideology has been used to justify horrific acts.
Gotcha.
It mentions the al-Qaeda attacks on 9/11, the assassinations of prominent political figures like Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and campaigns of terror waged by groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. It also includes actions by anti-abortion extremists in the USA as part of the spectrum of religiously motivated violence.
And the justification provided by those who commit these acts, how do they rationalize it?
The source notes that the most common fundamentalist justification for such extreme acts is that they are intended to eradicate evil and thus directly fulfill the will of God. It cites the belief among some Islamic suicide bombers that their actions are a form of martyrdom that guarantees them entry into heaven.
Wow. The source also links an increased incidence of fundamentalist violence to the concept of millenarianism. What's that?
Yes, millenarianism is the belief in a future 1,000-year period of divine rule or sudden, total emancipation for a chosen group. Think the millennium.
Okay.
While other ideologies like fascism and anarchism have exhibited forms of political millenarianism, religion adds a crucial element. Apocalypticism.
The end of the world stuff.
Exactly. Apocalypticism is the belief in the imminent end of the world as we know it, often associated with the return of a supreme figure, like Christ or the Mahdi, leading to final salvation, judgment, and purification.
So this apocalyptic belief can fuel a sense of urgency and justify extreme actions as necessary to kind of usher in or participate in this final purifying conflict.
Exactly. It elevates the political struggle to the level of cosmic eschatology, the ultimate destiny of humanity. The stakes couldn't be higher.
Okay, connecting these core themes back to you, listener. The source presents fundamentalism as a powerful, dynamic, and politically charged framework. It's defined by its drive to apply religious principles comprehensively to all aspects of public life, fundamentally rejecting the secular public-private divide.
Right. That's the core political project.
This impulse stems from a search for absolute truth and identity, often in reaction to modernity. And while largely operating peacefully within legal frameworks, its militant impulse, fueled by a strong us versus them identity and often a Manichaean worldview, means that in specific extreme instances, it has been undeniably linked to violence, sometimes tied to these apocalyptic beliefs. It's a complex force that shapes how its adherents view and interact with the world.
These themes, as outlined in the source, provide the underlying structure for understanding the diverse manifestations across different faiths that it then explores.
Let's move on to that then, the idea that fundamentalism is a family of movements, as suggested by Marty. What does the source say defines this family, and how do the members differ? If they share these themes, what makes them distinct?
Well, the source adopts Marty's concept of various fundamentalisms forming a hypothetical family, precisely because they share those core themes and that underlying impulse we just discussed.
Okay.
But it crucially highlights three key ways these family members differ significantly from one another, preventing us from treating them as identical or monolithic.
What are those three key differences?
First, obviously, they derive from very different source religions. The theology, history, and practices of Islam are vastly different from those of Christianity or Hinduism, for example.
Right.
The source notes that while fundamentalist-type movements can potentially emerge in any religion, Islam and Protestant Christianity might be more prone to this particular form of religio-political fundamentalism.
Why those two specifically?
It suggests it's because they are largely based on a single revered sacred text, the Quran and the Bible, respectively, and they emphasize direct individual access for believers to spiritual wisdom found within those texts, which can lend itself to activist reinterpretation.
Okay, so the specific faith tradition matters a lot. Second difference.
Second, they emerge in very different societal contexts. The specific impact, goals, and nature of fundamentalist movements are heavily conditioned by the particular social, economic, and political structures of the society in which they arise.
So fundamentalism in America looks different from fundamentalism in Iran or India.
Exactly. Fundamentalism in a developed liberal democracy will manifest very differently than in a post-colonial state or a society with a long history of religious dominance playing a public role. Context is key.
And the third difference.
Third, they differ according to the specific political causes they become associated with or adopt as their primary focus. What are they actually fighting for?
And the source groups these causes.
Yeah, broadly into three categories. Some fundamentalisms seek comprehensive political renewal for marginalized or oppressed people. Others aim to shore up an unpopular leader or government by trying to create a unified political culture based on religious identity. And a significant number seek to strengthen a threatened national or ethnic identity, using religion as a primordial basis for group solidarity.
That third point, linking fundamentalism to national or ethnic identity, seems particularly relevant in many conflict zones around the world today.
It's a very common linkage, yes.
The source then proceeds to look at the main forms of fundamentalism across different religious traditions, starting with Islamic fundamentalism, which gets quite a bit of detailed attention.
Yes. It notes Islam is the world's second largest and fastest growing religion, with a global spread across more than 70 countries, encompassing about 1.6 billion adherents at the time of writing.
And it reiterates Islam is seen as a complete way of life.
Yes, based on the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet Muhammad's teachings and practices. And it briefly mentions the historical Sunni-Shia split, which becomes relevant later.
And how does it define fundamentalism, specifically within Islam, given that context?
It emphasizes again that in this context, fundamentalism isn't just about believing the Quran is literally true, as most Muslims do. Instead, it's defined by an intense and militant faith in Islamic beliefs as the overriding principles that must govern all aspects of social life and politics.
The political goal is paramount.
Right. The political goals are often explicit, establishing an Islamic state or theocracy based on Sharia law. Politics is religion.
And the source traces the trajectory of its modern revival, the key moments.
Yeah, from early roots like the Muslim Brotherhood, founded in Egypt in the 1920s, to the really dramatic 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran under Ayatollah Khomeini, which established the first modern Islamic Republic.
A watershed moment.
Definitely. It notes that Islamist parties and movements have subsequently seized or gained significant political power in other states. More recently, since the 1990s, the source discusses the emergence of explicitly jihadi groups, like Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden.
A different kind of manifestation.
Yes, representing a particularly militant and transnational form, often directly targeting the USA, Israel, and broader Western influence.
The source then delves deeper into the explanations for this strengthening of Islamic fundamentalism, building on the earlier discussion of origins. It presents three main analytical lenses to understand it.
Yes. The first explanation it revisits is that controversial clash of civilizations view, specifically the incompatibility thesis.
Okay, remind us of that view.
This lens sees the source of militancy as residing within Islam itself, arguing for an inherent fundamental incompatibility between core Islamic values and the principles of the liberal democratic West.
So it blames Islam's core nature.
Essentially. This perspective often implies that Islam is inherently totalitarian, viewing the goal of an Islamic state based on Sharia as inherently anti-pluralist, denying individual freedom, and irreconcilable with the public-private divide. The term Islamofascism has sometimes been used in this context, which the source notes.
But the source immediately pushes back on that interpretation again, right? As it did before.
It does, strongly arguing that this view seriously misrepresents Islam's central tenets and historical character.
How so?
It points out that the Prophet Muhammad taught that the greater jihad is primarily an inner struggle for spiritual self-improvement, not political warfare. And it highlights Islam's rich historical exchange with Western ideas and its significant significant positive impact on Western culture throughout history, suggesting interaction and influence rather than inherent conflict.
So the source treats that first explanation with significant skepticism, focusing instead on historical and ideological factors. What's the second explanation for Islamic fundamentalism's rise?
This view portrays resurgent Islamic fundamentalism as a specific response to particular historical circumstances and a deep-seated sense of grievance. It cites historian Bernard Lewis here.
Okay, about circumstances.
This perspective argues that the Muslim world, particularly the Middle East, is in a state of crisis characterized by perceived decline and stagnation relative to the West, coupled with a profound sense of humiliation.
Where does this sense of humiliation come from? What are the historical roots?
The source links it to several factors. The collapse and carve-up of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, the sense of powerlessness stemming from the protracted Arab-Israeli conflict, and the feeling that even after formal colonialism ended, inefficient and often authoritarian regimes, coupled with neocolonialism, ensured continued global inequality and subordination, particularly to U.S. influence in the region.
So this frames Islamic fundamentalism primarily as a political and psychological phenomenon rooted in resentment and a quest for dignity and power.
Yes, resentment directed both inwards, at perceived un-Islamic or apostate leaders, the enemy within, and outwards, primarily at the USA, the enemy without, as the symbol of Western power and influence.
And there was an ideological gap.
The source adds that the perceived failure of Western imported secular ideologies, like socialism and secular Arab nationalism, in delivering prosperity and justice during the 1950s and 60s, created an ideological vacuum. This opening allowed fundamentalist ideas, offering a new path based on Islamic principles, to gain traction from the 1970s onwards, particularly attracting young and politically committed people disillusioned with those failed secular options.
That connection to the failure of alternative political models seems really key. What's the third explanation offered by the source?
This view interprets Islamic fundamentalism as a manifestation of a broader, deeper ideological tendency: anti-Westernism.
Okay.
The source cites Paul Berman, who places militant Islamism in the context of totalitarian movements that arose in the post-WWI era from the perceived failure of liberal society to provide meaning and order.
So drawing parallels with ideologies like fascism and communism again in terms of offering a totalizing vision.
Yes. The source notes that militant Islamism shares common features with fascism and communism in promising to rid society of corruption, create a new, pure social order, and establish society as a single block-like structure, solid and eternal, demanding total conformity. It also brings in Buruma and Margolid's concept of Occidentalism.
Occidentalism. The opposite of Orientalism, so an Eastern, often negative view of the West.
Exactly. It's described as a rejection of the cultural and political inheritance of the West, particularly the legacy of the Reformation and the Enlightenment.
And how does it view the West?
From this Occidentalist perspective, the West is seen as characterized by excessive individualism, godless secularism, corrosive relativism, and a mechanical civilization organized primarily around greed and materialism, a very negative picture.
And in contrast to this negative view of the West, what does this anti-Westernism offer?
Occidentalism, or this form of anti-Westernism, offers the promise of organic unity, moral certainty, collective purpose, and politico-spiritual renewal through adherence to traditional faith.
And these ideas aren't entirely new.
No, the source notes that these anti-Enlightenment ideas have older roots, influencing European fascism and Japanese imperialism in the early 20th century, and are now, in the modern world, most powerfully articulated through political Islam.
So Islamic fundamentalism is analyzed through these three sophisticated lenses, challenging the idea of inherent civilizational incompatibility, grounding it in specific historical circumstances of perceived decline and humiliation, and viewing it as a contemporary expression of a broader anti-Western ideology. But the source also stresses that even within Islamism, it's not a single monolithic movement. There are significant varieties. It's not all the same.
Absolutely not. The source highlights different forms that have emerged from various traditions and contexts. It starts with Wahhabism, also known as Salafism,
Which is associated with.
which is described as the official state-sponsored version of Islam in Saudi Arabia, arguably the world's first fundamentalist Islamic state.
And what characterizes Wahhabism? What makes it distinct?
It's described as a particularly strict, austere, and puritanical form of Islam. Its goal is to restore what its adherents see as the pure, original form of the faith by purging heresies and modern innovations seen as corrupting.
Innovations like
Yeah.
what gets banned.
The source provides specific examples of things Wahhabism has historically banned or severely restricted. Pictures, photographs, musical instruments, singing, videos, television, even celebrations of the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, which are seen as unauthorized innovations, not part of the original faith.
And its influence spread.
Its influence grew significantly due to Saudi control of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and, frankly, the immense wealth from oil exports used to promote its interpretation globally through mosques, schools, literature.
And the source notes Wahhabi ideas had an impact on the Muslim Brotherhood back in Egypt.
Yes, particularly its founder, Hassan al-Banna, who shared the goal of revitalizing a faith perceived as having been corrupted by external influences. The Brotherhood sought to provide a political voice for Islam and establish an Islamic government as a viable alternative to both capitalism and socialism.
Its goal was transformation.
Yes, applying Islamic principles to transform society from the ground up. It spread widely through the region and played a key role in preparing youth for the concept of jihad, though interpretations of that varied.
And Sayyid Qutb, often called the father of modern political Islam, emerged from the Brotherhood. His ideas were influential.
Hugely influential, and the source notes his radicalization was significantly influenced by a visit to the USA in the late 1940s.
What happened there?
It left him with a profound distaste for perceived materialism, superficiality, immorality, and sexual licentiousness in American society. He was apparently quite shocked by it.
And his worldview, Qutbism, reflected that.
It highlighted the barbarism and corruption, Jahiliyyah, echoing the pre-Islamic age of ignorance, that westernization and secularism inflicted on Muslim societies. Qutb saw a strict adherence to Islamic practice in all aspects of life as the only path to salvation.
And who were his main targets?
The source notes a key distinction in his political targets compared to later figures like bin Laden. While bin Laden focused on the West itself, the far enemy, Qutb's primary targets were the secularized, Western-influenced rulers of Muslim states, the near enemy who, in his view, had betrayed Islamic principles and become apostates.
And the Taliban regime in Afghanistan is presented as exemplifying Qutb's ideas in practice when they took power.
They are. The source presents the Taliban as embodying Qutbism in many ways, refusing to compromise with non-Islamic ideas, aiming to root out all perceived non-Islamic corruption, and enforcing an extremely harsh literalist interpretation of Sharia law.
And the source details some of the restrictions they imposed, which were quite severe.
Yes, it details some of the restrictions. Women were largely excluded from education, the economy, and public life. Strict censorship was enforced, music was banned, and their rule was deeply authoritarian, prioritizing religious conformity above all else. A very stark example.
Okay, moving from those Sunni examples to Shia fundamentalism.
Yeah.
The source notes its distinct character. How does it differ?
It's described as having a different historical trajectory, emotional temper, and doctrinal character. While Sunni Islam often views history as a progression away from an ideal past, the time of the Prophet, Shia Islam holds the belief that divine guidance is imminent and about to reemerge with the return of the hidden Imam, or Mahdi. This frames history as moving towards an ideal community guided by divine wisdom.
So it's more future-oriented, in a way, messianic.
It gives the Shia sect a strong messianic and emotional quality, yes, waiting for the return.
And how does this emotional intensity relate to politics?
Well, the source notes that Shia belief in the capacity for individuals to remove sin through suffering and devout life gives them a characteristic spiritual intensity. When this zeal is harnessed to a political goal, as in Shia fundamentalism, it generates a particularly fierce and uncompromising commitment.
And they're more inclined to political action.
The Shia sect has historically been more oriented towards political action than Sunni Islam often has, appealing particularly to the poor, the marginalized, and the downtrodden. For them, the reemergence of divine wisdom and authority represents not just purification, but the revolutionary overthrow of injustice and liberation from oppression.
And the prime example of this, the source says, is the 1979 Iranian Revolution under Ayatollah Khomeini.
Absolutely. The revolution led to the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran, transferring ultimate political authority to the clerics, Velayat Faqih, guardianship of the jurist.
How does that work in practice?
The source notes that under this system, all legislation passed by the elected assembly must be reviewed and ratified by a powerful council of clerics, the Guardian Council, to ensure absolute conformity to Islamic principles.
And the character of the early Iranian state.
Particularly in its early years, it exhibited a fierce religious consciousness, intense antipathy to the Great Satan, the USA, and applied strict Islamic principles to social and political life across the board.
The source provides some specific, vivid details about the application of Sharia in post-revolution Iran to illustrate this comprehensive approach.
Yes, to show the extent of this project of integrating religion and politics fully. It details the imposition of mandatory headscarves, hijab, and loose clothing for all women in public, the removal of earlier restrictions on polygamy for men, and the banning of contraception.
And criminal penalties.
More dramatically, it notes the application of severe criminal penalties derived from Sharia, such as public flogging or execution for adultery and the death penalty for homosexuality. These examples highlight just how comprehensively the state sought to dictate public and even private life based on a particular interpretation of religious law.
So Iran became Islamized.
Yes. The source adds that Iran was thoroughly Islamized, with weekly Friday prayers in Tehran evolving into a crucial focal point for demonstrating official policy and political loyalty.
But the source also points out the internal complexity and evolution of Iran since 1979. It hasn't been static.
No, definitely not. It notes the coexistence and constant tension between radical and reformist, traditionalist and modernizing tendencies within the system.
Like after Khomeini.
Right. The end of the Iran-Iraq War and Khomeini's death in 1989 seemed to open space for more moderate or pragmatic figures, like Rafsanjani. But then the election of Ahmadinejad years later signaled a return to a more hardline Khomenism.
And dissent.
The source notes that the brutal suppression of protests and dissenting voices, like the Green Movement, highlights the deeply polarized nature of Iranian politics and the reliance of radical elements on paramilitary support, like the Baathis, to maintain control. It's a complex picture.
And finally, within Islamism, the source introduces the possibility of a more moderate or constitutional form, using Turkey as a notable example.
Yes. It suggests that Islam's inherent tolerance of other religions might, in some contexts, provide a doctrinal basis for reconciliation with political pluralism and secular democracy.
Even though Turkey was founded as secular.
Exactly. Turkey, founded by Ataturk on strict secularism and a Western model, saw the significant growth of political Islam, culminating in the AK Party coming to power in 2003.
And the AK Party is presented as representing a more constitutional form of Islamism.
Yes. Attempting to balance a moderate, conservative political platform based on Islamic values with an acceptance of Turkey's existing secular democratic framework. They have sought to establish a Turkish identity that feels comfortable being part of both the East and the West.
With eyes on Europe.
Right, with attempts to join the European Union being a key aspiration that required alignment with Western democratic and human rights norms, at least on paper.
But the source leaves this point with a critical question about its viability.
A very fundamental one for the long term. Whether constitutional Islamism has genuine long-term viability. It asks whether a true acceptance of human rights and liberal democratic principles, including individual freedoms, pluralism, minority rights, doesn't necessarily mean that politics must eventually be substantially decoupled from religion, returning faith primarily to the private sphere. Can you have both?
That question about the ultimate compatibility of deeply held religious principles as a basis for state law with liberal secular frameworks is absolutely central to many global debates. Okay, let's turn now to Christian fundamentalism, the next major form the source examines.
Right. It notes Christianity's scale, world's largest religion, around 2 billion adherents at the time, originating in Palestine but spreading globally.
But its center has shifted.
Yes. While it experienced decline in the developed West during the 20th century, it saw vigorous growth in the developing world, meaning the majority of Christians now live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. A big shift.
And it mentions the main divisions, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, emphasizing the latter for fundamentalism.
Yes. Catholicism with its hierarchical structure and papal leadership, Orthodoxy emerging from the historical split with Rome, and Protestantism arising from the Reformation.
And Protestantism is characterized by
its emphasis on the Bible as the sole source of religious truth, sola scriptura, and the idea of a direct personal relationship between the individual believer and God without needing priestly intermediaries. That direct access to the text is key.
The source notes a general decline in Christianity's direct political significance in the West since the Reformation period. Why was that?
Yes, linking it to the advance of liberal constitutionalism, the increasing separation of church and state, and the broader secularization of public life we discussed earlier.
So Christianity adapted.
In the developed West, the source argues Christianity largely adjusted by becoming more of a personal religion. The focus shifted primarily to individual spiritual salvation rather than the moral and political regeneration of society as a whole. Less about building Christendom, more about saving souls.
And how did this context shape the character of Christian fundamentalism when it reemerged politically in the late 20th century?
Confronted by already established, stable secular structures and liberal political systems, fundamentalists in this context, the source argues, have largely worked within pluralist and constitutional frameworks.
So, generally less revolutionary than some forms of Islamic fundamentalism described earlier. They weren't aiming for theocracy.
That's the key distinction the source makes regarding their typical political goals in established liberal democracies. Rather than seeking a revolutionary overthrow, their campaigns have usually focused on single moral or social issues like abortion, school prayer, gay rights. They engaged in political lobbying, activism, and moral crusading within the existing system.
Okay. However, the source notes that Christian fundamentalism has also played a significant role in articulating and mobilizing ethnic nationalism in certain contexts. It cites Northern Ireland as a clear example.
Yes. The upsurge in evangelical Protestantism there linked to the Troubles after 1969.
Embodied by whom?
This was largely expressed politically through Ian Paisley's Free Presbyterian Church and its political arm, the Democratic Unionist Party, DUP. Ulster fundamentalism, the source explains, equates the idea of a united Ireland with the victory of Catholicism and the authority of the Pope, which they see as an existential threat to their religious and cultural identity as Protestants and British subjects.
And Paisley's stance, according to the source, was it violent?
The source states he has not actively promoted or engaged in paramilitary violence himself. However, he repeatedly warned that reunification or perceived concessions to Catholicism would inevitably lead to armed resistance by the Protestant community to defend their identity and territory. No surrender.
A powerful, mobilizing message.
Yes. The source suggests that Paisley and his supporters, drawing theological inspiration partially from the USA and appealing strongly to working-class Protestants and fundamentalists, succeeded in keeping the iron in the soul of Ulster Unionism, providing an uncompromising voice that blocked moves towards a united Ireland for decades.
Which leads us to perhaps the most influential and studied Christian fundamentalist movement globally, the New Christian Right in the USA.
Yes. The USA is noted as an outlier among Western countries due to its high level of religiosity. The source cites figures like 60 million born-again Christians at the time, about half of whom might identify as fundamentalists.
And its history.
It mentions the USA's historical role as a refuge for various religious sects seeking freedom, and notes the 19th century culture wars within American Protestantism between theological modernists and literalists. But it stresses that historically, religious passions were largely confined to private life and denominational battles. Religious groups rarely succeeded in forming powerful, unified political blocs on the national stage.
So the emergence of the New Christian Right in the late 1970s was a truly novel political development in the U.S. context.
Absolutely. It's described as a novel fusion of religion and politics, explicitly aiming to turn America back to Christ or restore the nation's perceived Christian foundations.
And New Christian Right is an umbrella term.
Yes, for a broad coalition of evangelical Protestants who mobilized politically, primarily focusing on moral and social issues, with the explicit goal of restoring a perceived lost Christian culture to public life.
What specific factors does the source identify as explaining this unprecedented emergence? Why then?
Two main factors are highlighted. First, the significant extension of the public sphere and federal state power in the post-WWII USA. This included controversial Supreme Court rulings, like those against mandatory prayer in public schools, which fundamentalists saw as an attack on public faith, even though it was based on the First Amendment separation clause. It also included the expansion of federal welfare and urban development programs, notably under Lyndon Johnson's Great Society initiatives in the 1960s.
And this growth of federal power and secular public institutions was seen as a threat by conservatives.
Yes. The source explains that many God-fearing social conservatives, particularly but not exclusively in the South, felt that their traditional values, lifestyles, and local autonomy were being directly threatened and undermined by this expansion of a secular, federal, Washington-based liberal establishment.
Okay, that's one factor. What was the second factor driving this political mobilization?
The increasing political prominence and assertiveness of previously marginalized minority groups in American society. The source mentions blacks, women, and homosexuals specifically.
And their progress was seen as a threat.
Their social and political advances, particularly from the civil rights era onwards, were perceived by many traditionalists as directly threatening established social structures, particularly the patriarchal family structure and traditional norms prevalent in rural and small-town America.
Yeah.
Fear of change.
So the campaigns of the new Christian right focused on restoring traditional family values in response to these perceived threats from secular government and social change.
Exactly. From the late 1970s onwards, their political campaigns centered on cultural and social issues linked to this theme. Specific targets, as noted by the source, included affirmative action policies, the feminist movement, and the burgeoning gay rights movement.
And abortion became central.
In the 1980s and 90s, the controversial issue of abortion following the Roe v. Wade decision became perhaps the single most central and mobilizing focus of their activism.
And various organizations were formed to channel this energy and activism.
Many were often effectively mobilized and publicized by prominent televangelists using modern media like television. The source lists groups like the Religious Roundtable, Christian Voice, the American Coalition for Traditional Values, and the most influential early group, the Moral Majority, founded by Baptist minister Jerry Falwell in 1980.
And these groups drew primarily from evangelical Protestants. What defines them?
Yes, they represent a broad range within evangelicalism, but share key characteristics. They are Bible believers, subscribing to scriptural inerrancy, the literal truth of the Bible, and are often described as born again through a personal conversion experience.
But they weren't monolithic.
No, the source notes that even within this group, divisions exist, for example, between fundamentalists who traditionally sought separation from non-believing society and charismatics who emphasized spiritual gifts like prophecy and healing and were sometimes more engaged with the world.
And the key to their influence was political engagement, getting involved in elections.
Absolutely. From the 1980s, groups like the Moral Majority became significantly involved in political action. Campaign finance, massive voter registration, drives targeting their base, targeting liberal Democrats for defeat, and lobbying the Republican Party to embrace a social and moral agenda.
And the Republicans responded.
Yes, Ronald Reagan's embrace of many elements of this agenda in the 1980s cemented the new Christian right's position as an important component of the Republican coalition, alongside conservative economic and foreign policy interests. They became a key voting bloc.
The source notes their influence fluctuated after Reagan's presidency, though. It wasn't a straight lineup.
It did fluctuate. Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush, wasn't perceived as fully committed to their social agenda. Setbacks, like televangelist Pat Robertson's unsuccessful bid for the Republican presidential nomination in 1992, led some more extreme elements within the movement to adopt increasingly militant and anti-government strategies.
Leading to extremism.
This contributed to the rise of groups like the militias influenced by Christian patriots ideology, and in some rare extreme cases resorting to terrorism, with the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 cited by the source as an example tied to this radical fringe, though not mainstream, Christian right.
But they saw a renewed boost with George W. Bush's election in 2000.
Yes. The source points out that several key figures, including President Bush and Vice President Cheney, identified as born-again Christians, and a leading figure in the Christian right, John Ashcroft, was appointed Attorney General. That sent a clear signal.
And fundamentalist influence became particularly visible in U.S. foreign policy after the 9/11 attacks, according to the source.
Yes, it identifies two key areas where this influence was felt.
Which were?
First, it contributed to a greater emphasis on humanitarianism and human rights in U.S. foreign policy, leading to significant increases in foreign aid, particularly to Africa for things like AIDS relief.
Okay, that's okay.
Second, and perhaps more controversially, it deepened U.S. support for Israel and influenced the framing and conduct of the war on terror.
How so? What's the connection to Israel?
The source mentions a specific interpretation highlighted by Walter Russell Mead that the decline and poverty of the Arab world are sometimes interpreted by certain evangelical Christians through a biblical lens as a sign of God cursing those who curse Israel, a reference to Genesis. Therefore, politically and militarily, bolstering Israel's position becomes a prime focus of U.S. foreign policy for theological reasons, fulfilling prophecy or divine will.
That's a striking example of how religious belief, in this fundamentalist form, can be directly linked to specific, high-stakes foreign policy priorities. Okay, finally, the source briefly looks at other fundamentalisms. What falls into this category?
Yes, it groups Hindu, Sikh, Jewish, and Buddhist fundamentalisms together here. It suggests that while they share the core fundamentalist impulse we've discussed,
Right.
their political goals are often less focused on comprehensive societal renewal along purely religious lines, like an Islamic state or turning America back to Christ. Instead, they're more focused on clarifying or redefining national or ethnic identity, particularly in societies facing identity crises or intergroup conflict.
So in these cases, fundamentalism acts almost as a subvariety of ethnic nationalism. Religion becomes the marker of the nation.
Precisely. These movements often arise as a reaction to perceived threats to national identity, the growth or assertiveness of rival ethnic or religious groups, or territorial disputes. The source explains that religion is attractive in these contexts because it can provide a supposedly primordial, immutable, and unchangeable basis for group membership and identity.
Solidifying the U.S.
Right, leading to the development of strong enclave cultures. It contrasts the Ulster Protestant example, where Presbyterianism provides the ethnic substance to their British identity, with the USA context, where Christian fundamentalism is more about moral social issues across a diverse population, less tied to one specific ethnicity.
Let's look at Hinduism in India then. How does fundamentalism manifest there?
Hinduism is the principal religion of India, obviously, but on the surface, the source notes it seems less susceptible to the kind of fundamentalism based on a single text because it's such a diverse ethnic religion, deeply tied to a vast array of customs and practices rather than just one book or doctrine.
But a movement still emerged.
Yes, a potent fundamentalist movement did emerge from India's independence struggle and has significantly flourished since the mid-1980s.
What's the key goal of this Hindu fundamentalism, often called Hindutva?
To challenge India's constitutionally enshrined multicultural, mosaic, and secular identity by making Hinduism the primary basis of national identity, the idea of Hindutva or Hinduness.
So India as a Hindu nation, what about minorities?
While generally not seeking outright expulsion of minorities, though some rhetoric goes there, the source notes the movement calls for the Hinduization of other communities like Muslims, Sikhs, and Jains, demanding their assimilation into a Hindu-dominated national culture.
And politically.
The Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, is the largest political party associated with this movement, articulating the concerns of a rising middle class grappling with modernity and perceived weakening national identity. More radical groups like the World Hindu Council, India for Hindus, and the paramilitary like RSS, Greater India, have even more expansive and exclusive goals.
And the source points to a dramatic, violent example of Hindu fundamentalist militancy showing the potential danger.
Yes, the destruction of the Babri Masjid Mosque in Ayodhya in 1992 by Hindu nationalists.
Why there?
They claimed the mosque was built on the sacred birthplace of the Hindu god Rama. This act triggered widespread communal violence across India, particularly horrific riots in Gujarat, and continues to be a source of deep tension. It illustrates the potential for ethno-religious fundamentalism to incite large-scale conflict.
Okay. Sikh fundamentalism is presented somewhat differently, linked more directly to separatism.
It is. It's strongly associated with the struggle for an independent Sikh nation-state called Khalistan in the Punjab region of India.
How does it differ from standard nationalism?
While overlapping with liberal nationalism in its goal of statehood, the source distinguishes it by its vision of the nation as an essentially religious entity. The goal was often Sikhism as the state religion based on the revered Guru Granth Sahib text.
And like Hindu nationalism, it was partly defined in opposition to others.
Yes, particularly in antipathy towards Hinduism and the Indian central government dominated by Hindus.
And it also had a militant phase.
Yes. The source mentions key events illustrating its militancy, including the seizure of the sacred Golden Temple in Amritsar in 1982 by the militant Damdami Taksal led by Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. This led to a deadly siege by the Indian Army, Operation Blue Star.
And the consequences.
The subsequent assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in 1984 by her Sikh bodyguards in retaliation for the Golden Temple assault. The source notes that the upsurges in Hindu, Sikh, and Islamic fundamentalism in the Indian subcontinent are complexly interconnected, often fueling a chain reaction and powerfully linking ethnic identity to religious fervor and conflict.
A dangerous mix. Jewish fundamentalism in Israel is another example linked to ethnic and territorial conflict.
Yes, the source distinguishes it from some ultra-Orthodox, Haredim Jewish communities who, paradoxically, may reject the modern state of Israel on religious grounds.
Why would they reject Israel?
believing a truly Jewish state can only be established by divine intervention at the coming of the Messiah, not by secular Zionists. Jewish fundamentalists, in contrast, are often intensely political.
And they have a different view of Zionism.
They have transformed Zionism, the movement for a Jewish homeland, into a defense of a religiously defined greater land of Israel, often characterized by territorial aggressiveness towards Palestinians based on biblical claims.
And movements supporting this view.
Groups like Gush Emanim, Bloc of the Faithful, are cited for their persistent campaign to build Jewish settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, which they see as divinely mandated land.
And more radical elements.
More radical groups like Catch, founded by Rabbi Meir Kahan, openly proclaimed that Jews and Arabs could never live together and advocated for the complete expulsion of all Arabs from the Promised Land, leading to it being banned as racist in Israel.
And their political influence.
The source notes that even relatively small, ultra-Orthodox and fundamentalist parties in Israel can exert disproportionate political influence because their support is often crucial for forming governing coalitions in the Knesset, Israel's parliament. They become kingmakers.
Finally, Buddhist fundamentalism in Sri Lanka. This seems counterintuitive given Buddhism's image.
It does. This movement largely arose from the historical tension between the majority Sinhalese ethnic group, who are predominantly Buddhist, and the minority Tamil community, who are mostly Hindu.
And Buddhism itself seems less prone to this.
On the surface, yes. Buddhism might appear least susceptible to fundamentalism due to its core tenets emphasizing toleration, nonviolence, and individual enlightenment rather than a single text or doctrine demanding conversion or political conformity. The source argues that Theravada Buddhism, particularly in southern Asia, has supported fundamentalist-type developments when nationalism and religious revivalism become intertwined.
So religion and ethnicity fused again.
Exactly. When Sinhala identity became strongly fused with Buddhist identity.
And this intertwined national religious identity led to specific political demands from Buddhist groups.
Yes. Militant Sinhalese Buddhist groups, like the People's Liberation Front, JVP, pushed for the Sinhalization of national identity and demanded that Buddhism be enshrined as the state religion, despite Sri Lanka's multi-ethnic and multi-religious population.
And the impact of this.
The source states that these ethno-religious fundamentalist pressures significantly fueled Tamil separatism and contributed to the long and brutal terrorist campaign waged by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, Tamil Tigers, another tragic example of ethno-religious conflict.
So connecting this extensive section back to you, our listener, the source reveals the incredible diversity within this fundamentalist family. It shows how the core fundamentalist impulse adapts dramatically to local contexts, specific historical grievances, and how deeply intertwined it can become with issues of national identity, ethnic conflict, and territorial claims.
Yeah, it's definitely not one size fits all.
And it illustrates that this dynamic can lead to intense political conflict and, in some cases, horrific violence, even in religions we might traditionally associate more strongly with nonviolence or an inward focus, like Buddhism.
This journey through the different forms really highlights that while a shared style and impulse might exist, the specific outworkings are deeply shaped by the unique circumstances of each society and faith tradition. You can't understand one without understanding the context.
Absolutely. Let's wrap up by looking at religious fundamentalism in the context of a global age. The source notes that many of the world's major religions had a global orientation long before modern globalization kicked into high gear.
Yes, it identifies two main historical reasons for this global reach, predating the internet and airplanes. First, religion often served as a crucial cultural dimension of imperial expansion. Christianity spread extensively through the Roman Empire and later accompanied European colonists across the globe. Islam likewise spread with successive empires like the Mughal, Safavid, and Ottoman empires, establishing faith across vast territories. Empire and faith often went hand in hand.
Okay, and the second reason related more to their core beliefs.
Their doctrinal character, specifically evangelicalism or proselytization.
The drive to convert others.
Exactly. Christianity and Islam, both claiming to be the one true religion and often holding that salvation is restricted to believers, view converting others as a sacred religious duty, a command to spread the faith, counter false religions, and save souls.
And this contrasts with other traditions.
Yes, the source contrasts this with religions like Judaism and Hinduism, where belief is traditionally tied to family, ethnicity, or caste, making conversion less central or even meaningless. And also with Buddhism, which is generally characterized by tolerance and does not claim a monopoly on truth or the path to enlightenment.
Okay, so religion was already global in many ways. But how has the increased global interconnectedness of the modern age globalization changed the nature and role of religion, and fundamentalism specifically?
Well, the source points out it's not merely a coincidence that the revival of fundamentalist movements in many countries occurred simultaneously with the period of accelerated globalization in the 1970s and 80s. There seems to be a link.
And globalization itself is complex.
Yes, it highlights that globalization is a complex, multidimensional process with seemingly contradictory effects.
Complex how? What are the contradictions?
On the one hand, it's associated with forces pushing towards homogenization, the weakening of cultural, social, economic, and political diversity worldwide through the spread of global markets, media, and norms. Think McDonald's everywhere.
Right, the McWorld idea.
It also simultaneously fuels localization, regionalization, and the assertion of particularist identities and movements. People push back.
And fundamentalism is part of that pushback.
The source frames fundamentalism as very much part of this latter trend, a reaction against homogenizing global forces, an assertion of particular identity.
So how exactly has globalization, despite sometimes being seen as secularizing, actually facilitated the rise and impact of fundamentalism? What are the mechanisms?
The source suggests at least three key ways. First, through the economic inequalities and asymmetries it creates or exacerbates.
How does that fuel fundamentalism?
The development of a global economy often benefits core countries at the expense of peripheral or developing ones, widening the gap between rich and poor within many countries. This, the source argues, creates a crucible of bitterness, resentment, and disappointment.
And fundamentalism offers an answer.
Given the perceived failure of secular ideologies like socialism and conventional nationalism to address these economic grievances, those frustrations were often channeled into politico-religious movements that promised justice, dignity, and restoration based on faith.
So globalization's economic impact fuels the social discontent fundamentalism can tap into. What's the second way globalization helps fundamentalism rise?
The cultural and economic impact of globalization, particularly in the developing world, is often felt as the imposition of alien values and practices, consumerism, secularism, individualism, Western media.
And people react against that.
Yes, it provokes a powerful backlash, leading to various counter-globalization movements. The source references Benjamin Barber's idea again, McWorld globalizing consumer culture versus jihad, fragmenting ethno-religious reaction.
And religion becomes the vehicle for that reaction.
This backlash so often takes the form of religious revivalism, the source suggests, because religion offers spirituality, moral certainty, and hope in the face of rapid disruptive change. It helps cultures that feel threatened to reaffirm and purify themselves by emphasizing traditional faith and identity against the perceived onslaught of global culture.
So globalization's cultural impact fuels a defensive, identity-based reaction. And the third way it facilitates fundamentalism, this one is maybe more practical.
Yes, globalization has significantly increased the organizational effectiveness and reach of fundamentalist groups.
Through technology.
Exactly. They have shown a distinct willingness and ability to utilize the modern information and communication technology made available by globalization itself.
Give us some examples.
The source gives examples. Leveraging television, from U.S. televangelists reaching millions to Al Jazeera broadcasting al-Qaeda statements, using mobile phones for coordination and mobilization, and extensively using the internet for communication, recruitment, fundraising, and spreading their message globally.
That's the paradox. Again, using the tools of the modern globalized world to promote an agenda that is often framed as anti-modern and anti-globalization.
Exactly. They're very adept at it, often.
But the source doesn't end there. It offers a powerful counter-argument, suggesting that globalization might ultimately contain the seeds of fundamentalism's failure. How could that be?
Yes, this is presented as a potentially powerful concluding thought from the source's analysis. It argues that the dominant trend within economic globalization supports and promotes a particular form of modernization, one with distinctly Western characteristics.
Mimi.
And crucially, this trend is linked to the seemingly irresistible long-term spread of liberal democracy around the world.
And liberal democracy, based on its core principles like the public-private divide, would push religion back into the private domain, undermining the fundamentalist project.
That's the argument presented. Democratization, built on liberal principles of individual rights, secular governance, and the separation of spheres, promises, in this view, to restore religion to what liberalism sees as its proper private domain.
Leaving public life secular.
Right, leaving public affairs, including politics and governance, to be debated and contested by secular political creeds and rational arguments, not dictated by religious dogma.
And if this trend towards liberal modernization and democratization prevails globally in the long run, what's the implication for fundamentalism?
If this process succeeds, the source concludes, fundamentalist religion in its politically active, public sphere dominating form may prove to be essentially a symptom of the difficult adjustments that modernization brings about. It's a reaction to the disruption, but perhaps not a sustainable long-term political force.
So it was doomed.
The source puts it starkly. It is doomed because it is out of step with the principal thrust of the modernization process itself, which, in this view, inevitably favors secular, rational, and liberal democratic forms of organization in the long run.
Wow. That's a strong, arguably optimistic counterpoint to all the ways the source detailed how globalization fueled fundamentalism. It suggests the very forces that seem to empower it might ultimately undermine it. Connecting this last section back to you, our listener. The source suggests that globalization is a complex, double-edged sword for religious fundamentalism.
Definitely complex.
It has certainly fueled its rise as a reaction against perceived economic inequalities, cultural intrusions, and the erosion of traditional identity. But according to this perspective, it might also contain the very forces, particularly the spread of liberal democracy and its emphasis on secular public life, that could ultimately lead to its decline as a major political force.
It leaves us with a dynamic and open-ended view of fundamentalism's place in the contemporary world, not as some ancient relic, but as a complex product of and reaction to modern global forces.
So, to bring together the main threads of our deep dive based on this source, religious fundamentalism, originating from that specific term in American Protestantism, is presented here not as simple literalism, but as a dynamic religio-political project.
The key is that religio-political link.
Right. Fundamentally aiming to apply religious principles comprehensively to all aspects of public life, rejecting the liberal public-private divide. Its modern rise is deeply tied to crises of identity and fueled by global forces like post-colonialism, the impacts of secularization, and globalization itself.
A creature of modernity, as it's said.
Yeah, it's characterized by core themes.
Yeah.
Seeing religion as politics, a fundamentalist impulse focused on extracting and adhering to absolute truths, often via activist interpretation and charismatic leaders, a complex relationship with anti-modernism that surprisingly involves selective engagement with modernity's tools, and a militant streak stemming from high-stakes beliefs and clear us versus them identities.
Which, while usually peaceful.
Right, usually peaceful and legal, but has been undeniably linked to violence in specific extreme cases, sometimes tied to apocalyptic beliefs. And crucially, it manifests in incredibly diverse ways across different religions and societies.
Huge diversity.
Whether seeking revolutionary theocracy, moral reform within a pluralistic system, or defining ethnic identity, it adapts to local contexts and grievances, often linked powerfully to national identity and conflict.
Understanding fundamentalism through these lenses, exploring its varied forms, motivations, and its complex relationship with modernity and globalization, as presented in this academic source, well, it provides crucial context, doesn't it?
It really does. Context for many contemporary global events, political dynamics, and conflicts you see discussed daily. It helps move past simplistic labels and recognize the underlying ideas, forces, and tensions at play, at least according to this text analysis.
Getting beyond the headlines.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. Thinking about the source's perspective, especially its closing argument about globalization and liberal democracy.
Yeah, that prediction of its decline.
If fundamentalism is partly a symptom of the difficult adjustments brought about by modernization and globalization, a reaction to their disruptive forces, does that mean it is indeed, as the source suggests, ultimately doomed to fade away as these processes continue and perhaps stabilize? Or will it prove to be a more enduring, adaptable force that finds new ways to express itself and challenge secularism in a constantly changing global landscape? Will it adapt again?
A question that this deep dive, guided by the source, really prompts us to consider deeply as we observe the world unfolding around us. Is it a temporary symptom or a permanent feature?
Something to think about until our next deep dive.